According to Witness C, Matlala recounted that shortly after Jotham Nsibi, the cartel's old patriarch, died, Sibiya approached him and said, "Since the old man has passed away, you will continue to take care of me." It was a chilling euphemism. The cartel's protector was effectively naming his price to keep shielding the next generation. A secret audio recording captured by police during Matlala's May 2025 house raid was played in the commission room, its crackling sound filling the air. On the tape, Matlala himself matter-of-factly describes how he took care of Sibiya after winning a 360 million rand SAPS Health Services tender contract. For investigators, moments like this are a reminder that the Big Five cartel is a generational organization that does not simply die when one leader is killed or jailed. In fact, the syndicate is widely believed to remain active and functioning, even with Vusimuzi Cat Matlala in jail and Katiso KT Molefe under probation and scrutiny. The question is no longer whether the cartel survived. The real question is, who is running it now, and how does the so-called Big Five cartel actually operate? To answer that, we need to go back to the 1990s when the organization was formed to see how it transitioned from a small circle of street gangsters and car hijackers into a conglomerated Big Five structure embedded in the taxi industry, multiple forms of trafficking, tenderpreneurship, SAPS capture, VIP security, politics, and much more. In the heart of Gauteng, a covert alliance was born long before most South Africans ever heard the phrase Big Five cartel. It did not start with a splashy cocaine bust or a viral clip of gunfire outside a nightclub. It began quietly, in the spaces where money, violence, and politics overlap. Taxi ranks, backroom meetings, cash businesses, and police offices where certain files were handled with unusual care. Over time, threads from Pretoria, Johannesburg, and Durban, taxi bosses, nightclub enforcers, tender entrepreneurs, compromised officers were drawn into one loom. Crime intelligence would eventually give it a name, a cartel built on taxis, drugs, contracts, and bullets, whose influence reached deep into the state. In leaked assessments and confidential briefings, investigators described a structure within the broader universe of the firm, a small circle of 5 key executives, each controlling strategic revenue streams and enforcement capabilities beneath an older patriarch. Journalists and whistleblowers came to know a handful of names: Jotham King Swazi Nsibi, the Pretoria taxi boss whose empire became the prototype; Vusimuzi Cat Matlala, the businessman with alleged tender and hit links; Katiso KT Molefe, the Sandhurst resident accused of coordinating hit squads; the Jakaba family of KwaZulu-Natal, a story for another day; and other associates whose roles blurred between patron, fixer, and enforcer. From the outside, individual crimes looked scattered. A DJ gunned down in Woodmead, a whistleblower engineer shot in Vereeniging, cocaine disappearing from police storerooms, a suspicious hospital tender worth hundreds of millions of rands. It took years before detectives realized that many of these events did not stand alone. The same surnames, the same companies, the same guns, and the same protectors kept reappearing. Behind the headlines, an organized system was taking shape, an ecosystem of violence and contracts that crime intelligence later described as one of the most entrenched and dangerous syndicates South Africa has ever seen.
The story of the Big Five cartel is not only about individual kingpins, it is the story of how a regional taxi empire in Pretoria became a launchpad for something bigger, a template for using associations, security firms, tenders, and political relationships to build an illicit state within a state. To understand how the Durban ports, Gauteng nightclubs, and national police leadership ended up entangled in this saga, we have to go back to where the model was first tested, on the streets and routes of Tshwane. The story of the Big Five cartel is not only about individual kingpins, it is the story of how a regional taxi empire in Pretoria became a launchpad for something bigger, a template for using associations, security firms, tenders, and political relationships to build an illicit state within a state. To understand how the Durban ports, Gauteng nightclubs, and national police leadership ended up entangled in this saga, we have to go back to where the model was first tested, on the streets and routes of Tshwane. Before we start peeling back those layers, tell us in the comments who you believe is effectively running the cartel today, the presumed next-in-command holding the seat that Vusimuzi Kat Matlala and Katiso KT Molefe can no longer occupy in public. Drop the name you think is really in charge now. If you want this investigation to keep exposing what sits behind the headlines, hit like and subscribe. And please share this video with family and friends who still think these stories are distant rumors. What we are about to reveal has never been laid out like this in the mainstream. Some of the most disturbing details come from insiders close to Lieutenant General Nyanla Mkhwanazi's investigation camp inside SAPS. This is the part of the story that those in power would prefer stayed buried.
It began on the streets of Pretoria in the turbulent 1990s. Jotham King Mswasi Msibi emerged from the taxi ranks at a time when routes were fought over with guns as often as with paperwork. Taxi violence in and around Tshwane had left its mark in burnt-out vehicles and chalk outlines on tar. In this chaos, Msibi saw something different. Not just a set of routes to defend, but an opportunity to build a structure that could sit above the conflict. Witnesses and former associates describe him as both a warlord and a broker. On one day, he could be seen calming rival taxi bosses in a tense meeting, insisting on peace deals and route sharing. On another, he allegedly deployed heavily armed men to enforce his decisions. Over time, he built a reputation as the man who could settle disputes or end them abruptly. People in the taxi world began to talk about the firm around Msibi, a reference to his network of allies, enforcers, and business interests that extended beyond any single association. Msibi's genius, investigators say, lay in how he blurred the line between formal leadership and underworld influence. He took positions in taxi structures, attended official meetings, and presented himself as a stabilizing figure in a violent sector. At the same time, he allegedly built a parallel system: loyal drivers and rank managers, private security guards, debt collectors, and gunmen who could be mobilized for more than just taxi disputes. In crime intelligence notes, this dual role is described as a prototype, a model in which one man could sit at the center of both legitimate transport and shadow governance. By the early 2000s, Pretoria's taxi wars had reached a fever pitch. Associations clashed over lucrative corridors feeding into the capital and neighboring townships. In that space, Msibi's peacemaking function gave him a unique kind of power. If he brokered peace, routes stayed open and money flowed. If talks failed, people died. According to testimony later led at commissions and in internal police analyses, this leverage turned Msibi from just another taxi boss into an informal authority figure over who lived, who worked, and who got to operate. At the same time, his business interests expanded. Former allies recall the acquisition of security contracts, links to fuel supply, and investments in properties far from the taxi ranks. The idea of the firm hardened, not a company registered at the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission, but a network of individuals and entities spanning taxis, security, recruitment, logistics, and protection. When trouble arose, Msibi could convene not just taxi leaders, but policemen, lawyers, and businessmen who owed him favors. It is in this environment that the first seeds of what would later be called the Big Five cartel were planted. Msibi's operation was large, but even he could not personally manage every stream: drugs, protection, debt collection, extortion, and contracts. Investigators say that he began to cultivate proteges, younger men who could handle specific portfolios while ultimately reporting back to him and his inner circle. Among those who emerged in this orbit were figures like Vusimuzi Kat Matlala and Katiso KT Molef. They did not start at the top. Early accounts portray them as men operating on the fringes of the taxi world and adjacent economies: collections, muscle, informal deals, side hustles that involved both risk and proximity to violence. Over time, they proved they could manage money, inspire fear when necessary, and build relationships with police and politicians that went beyond simple acquaintance. Parallel to this, Msibi's reputation for reaching into the state grew. Crime intelligence officers would later tell inquiries that certain cases involving his associates failed to progress, dockets stalled, and key witnesses were intimidated into silence. The idea took hold that the firm was not just a taxi structure, but a shadow cabinet of criminal influence, with Msibi as a kind of president and a handful of younger men as his ministers. Yet, even as Msibi's reach expanded, there were limits. Aging, ongoing police attention, and the changing dynamics of the drug and contract economy meant that new hands would need to take on more direct roles. It is in this moment, when the firm's Pretoria prototype was looking for continuity, that the foundations of the Big Five executive began to solidify. The next stage of the story would not be fought only in taxi ranks, but in boardrooms, nightclubs, and ports.
The first of the two men later cast as key executives beneath the firm's umbrella, Vusimuzi Kat Matlala, did not begin life in luxury. Raised in modest circumstances, he grew up in an environment where crime, hustling, and survivalism were never far away. Early accounts from those who knew him speak of a young man with sharp instincts for money and a willingness to operate in gray zones, informal loans, disputed debts, off-book deals. His nickname, Cat, would later be tied by some to the perception that he survived encounters that should have finished him. Matlala's early brushes with the law were not yet the stuff of national headlines. Court records and community stories point to allegations of robbery, intimidation, and involvement in cash-in-transit-related schemes. Some charges were withdrawn, some cases collapsed, and others never progressed beyond whispers. For investigators who later revisited this period, a pattern emerged. This was a man who seemed to understand where the weaknesses in the system lay, which officers could be leaned on, which prosecutors were overloaded, which witnesses could be persuaded or frightened into disappearing. Over time, Matlala shifted from being merely a participant in violent hustles to someone who operated businesses with a respectable face. Companies linked to him appeared in the security, medical supplies, and logistics sectors, sometimes as legitimate contractors, sometimes later named in allegations of fronting and overpricing. To the public, he presented as a businessman and community figure. To detectives, he began to look like a bridge between street-level crime and the world of high-value state tenders. Katiso KT Molefe's path took shape along a slightly different arc, but in a similar ecosystem. He too emerged from environments where violence and opportunity were often intertwined, townships where armed robberies, illicit guns, and hustles were part of daily reality. Early accounts and police notes refer to his proximity to armed gangs, suspected involvement in organized robberies, and an ability to navigate between blue-collar muscle and white-collar spaces. By the mid-2010s, Molefe had moved beyond simple hustles. He was associated with properties in affluent suburbs, became linked to security and logistics businesses, and cultivated an image of a successful entrepreneur. Yet behind this image, prosecutors would later allege, lay a more sinister reality. A man deeply enmeshed in networks of hitmen, illegal firearms, and contracts that connected murders in townships to disputes in boardrooms. The convergence point between these men and Msibi's firm was not random. Investigators say that by this time, the firm was in need of operators who could straddle both underworld and institutional arenas. Matlala, with his tender-linked businesses and alleged access to senior police and political figures, fit the profile of a fixer executive. Molefe, with his alleged command over hit squads and proximity to both nightlife and engineering-linked contracts, fit the profile of an enforcer executive. Evidence later presented in affidavits and commission testimony paints a picture of complementary roles. Matlala's companies would allegedly secure lucrative contracts, for example, supplying medical equipment or services to police. Molefe's network, according to prosecutors, would be called upon when someone needed to be silenced, warned, or removed. Both men, in this view, operated under the broader protection of a system that Msibi had helped build, one where politics, policing, and criminal enterprise were glued together by money and fear. Crucially, the emergence of these executives coincided with a shift in the nature of crime in Gauteng. The line between taxi disputes, drug trafficking, and tender battles blurred. Nightclubs became spaces where cartel business was allegedly conducted under the cover of entertainment. Engineers and civil servants who tried to question contracts found themselves increasingly at risk. Guns moved from township ambushes to quiet cul-de-sacs in affluent suburbs. The firm's model was no longer just about controlling routes, it was about controlling entire value chains, from imported drugs and local distribution to state tenders and enforcement. In this phase, the term Big Five began circulating among certain investigators and analysts. It was not an official legal label, but a shorthand for the inner circle believed to sit beneath Msibi, powerful enough to direct streams of money and violence, each with his own portfolio, yet bound together by shared interests and mutual protection. In public, they were businessmen and community leaders. In sealed crime intelligence files, they were sketched as executives of a cartel. By the time Msibi's health and age became serious factors, the system was already moving beyond him. Whether he formally anointed successors or the structure evolved organically remains a matter of debate, but what is clear is that figures like Matlala and Molefe were no longer simply proteges. They were central players in a multi-layered network that quietly fused violent enterprise with political and institutional influence. The model built in Pretoria was about to be exported to a far larger stage. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If a model like this could grow from Pretoria's taxi ranks into hospitals, ports, and police headquarters, do we really think it has disappeared, or has it simply changed logos and moved closer to where you live? Tell us honestly in the comments whether you believe these networks are collapsing or just getting smarter. And if you want the next part of this investigation, when we follow the money, the ports, and the guns even further, hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned so you don't miss what comes next.
Durban, mid-2021. Acting on a tip from a dock worker informant, an elite police task force converged on a shipping depot in Isipingo. Their target was a consignment that had triggered quiet alarm among a handful of officers who still believed in the job. A set of containers whose paperwork did not quite match their cargo. Under the fluorescent lights of the warehouse, they pried open pallets, sliced open packaging, and found bricks wrapped with extraordinary care. Tests confirmed what the more experienced officers already suspected: pure cocaine, concealed in a consignment that was supposed to be something far more innocuous. The seizure was one of several that, taken together, began to reveal just how important ports like Durban had become to South Africa's role in the global drug trade.
Intelligence reports described routes in which cocaine produced in South America was shipped via West African networks, sometimes moved through ports further north and ultimately fed into Durban's busy harbor. Officially, the containers carried frozen chicken, industrial materials, or other bulk goods. Unofficially, they were vehicles for a commodity that offered a staggering return on investment. Behind these consignments stood international crime groups and local partners. Investigators tracking the money trail found that some of the same types of front companies that appeared in the firm's tender world, logistics outfits, import-export businesses, storage facilities, were also used to receive, move, and disguise drug shipments. In some cases, company names overlapped. In others, shared directors, phone numbers, or bank accounts suggested a web of relationships that extended well beyond any single deal. The Port Shepstone 541-kilogram cocaine scandal, in which a massive haul disappeared from police custody, became a case study in how deeply organized crime had penetrated the state. What was supposed to be a triumph for law enforcement turned into an embarrassment and a warning signal. The drugs vanished from a supposedly secure storeroom, and the ripples from that disappearance flowed through crime intelligence, internal affairs, and the courts. For investigators later examining the Big Five cartel, this incident served as a grim example of how evidence against powerful networks could simply evaporate. Within this landscape, Durban was not the only node. Smaller ports, coastal towns, and inland distribution points formed part of a latticework of storage, cutting, wholesale, and retail. From warehouses, cocaine moved into cities, nightclubs, taxi-linked distribution networks, and private parties. At each step, local partners took their cut. Money was collected in cash, then laundered through restaurants, car dealerships, property purchases, and, critically, state contracts. Prosecutors and journalists probing the Big Five's alleged role in these flows pointed to patterns rather than single smoking guns. Certain security and logistics companies tied to known firm associates seemed disproportionately involved in movements linked to ports. Known associates of Madlala and Molefe appeared in call records and financial analyses connected to drug investigations. In crime intelligence reports, these individuals were not always labeled as drug lords in the classic sense. Instead, they were described as facilitators and protectors, people who could ensure that the right containers slid through, that problematic files went missing, and that, when necessary, those who threatened the flow of money were dealt with. Money moving in from cocaine shipments did not sit idle. It was allegedly used to buy properties in affluent suburbs, fund luxury lifestyles, bankroll taxi fleets, and, crucially, secure influence. Donations, formal and informal, were made to certain political campaigns. Generous sponsorships maintained access to key decision-makers. In some cases, payments were allegedly structured as consulting fees or service contracts from front companies to individuals in positions of authority. Internationally, South African networks like the firm/Big Five slotted into a broader chain. European buyers depended on consistent supply. South American producers needed reliable routes. West African intermediaries connected the dots. South Africa's ports offered both infrastructure and a veneer of legitimacy, a country with busy terminals, modern logistics, and, as subsequent scandals would show, enough gaps in oversight for well-connected syndicates to exploit. For detectives trying to map the Big Five's place in this ecosystem, the picture that emerged was not of a single drug boss personally handling every shipment. Rather, it was of a cartel in which some executives focused on import and logistics, others on local distribution and protection, and still others on using the proceeds to buy political and institutional cover. The same way Musibi had earlier used taxis and security contracts as levers, the next generation allegedly used ports, warehouses, and tenders as pillars of a larger, more lucrative structure. As cocaine money pulsed through this network, it amplified everything around it. Bribes became bigger, lawyers became more expensive, bodyguards became more heavily armed. The risk, too, escalated. Loads were hijacked not only by rival criminals, but in some cases by corrupt law enforcement members willing to resell what they had seized. In this pressure cooker, silence and loyalty became commodities that had to be fiercely enforced. That is where the next dimension of the Big Five's alleged operation comes into view, the world of hit squads and the fear economy that kept the system intact. Night falls over Gauteng's club districts and the mood shifts. Cars with dark tinted windows line the streets outside popular venues. Inside, DJs play to packed rooms, while in private booths, deals are made over bottles and laughter. Behind the soundtrack and neon, however, another economy is at work, one built not on ticket sales or bar tabs, but on intimidation, extortion, and targeted violence. The killings of artists like DJ City Lights, Vusi Ma R5, Heavy Pablo, DJ Vintos, and DJ Somebody shocked the public. Each case, taken alone, could be framed as a tragic incident in a country with a high murder rate. Together, they began to look like a pattern. Many of these victims operated at the intersection of music, alcohol, nightlife, and taxi-linked promotion circuits. They were not only entertainers, they were, in some cases, gatekeepers of visibility and influence in environments where drug distribution, protection rackets, and the enforcement of taxes on businesses overlapped. Investigators and journalists examining these assassinations pointed to recurring features. In several cases, the shootings were executed with chilling precision. Ambushes at traffic lights, bursts of automatic gunfire, multiple shooters, and careful planning that suggested professional hit teams rather than spontaneous robberies. Ballistic reports tied some of these attacks to the same or overlapping weapons. The same firearm or set of firearms appeared in multiple dockets, linking seemingly unrelated crime scenes. Behind the triggermen, affidavits later alleged, stood organizers connected to wider networks. In certain police analyses, these networks were linked back to individuals associated with the firm and the Big Five, men who operated in both nightlife promotion and taxi and security structures. In this view, artists who fell out of line, refused to pay taxes, challenged certain deals, or were perceived as liabilities could find themselves in the crosshairs of a system that used assassination as a management tool. The fear economy did not target artists alone. Taxi bosses who resisted incorporation into larger structures, businessmen who interfered with drug distribution routes, and engineers who questioned tenders also faced risk. The murder of engineer Armand Swart in Vereeniging was emblematic of how this violence spilled into the world of state-owned enterprises. Swart, who had raised concerns about irregularities in contracts linked to Transnet, was shot dead in what investigators described as a case of mistaken identity, the intended target believed to have been someone else close to the tender trail. Yet even with that caveat, the message to would-be whistleblowers was unmistakable. Cell phone records, vehicle tracking data, and financial analyses in multiple cases suggested overlapping clusters, the same hitmen appearing in different dockets, the same intermediaries arranging logistics, the same circles of alleged masterminds benefiting from the removal or intimidation of inconvenient individuals. Prosecutors would later argue that this was not chaos but a market, a parallel industry of contract killing where prices could be discussed, jobs assigned, and payments arranged through intermediaries linked to broader criminal and business networks. In this market, individuals like KT Molef are alleged to have played a central role. In affidavits related to the Swart and DJ cases, Molef is painted by the state as someone with access to both funding and human resources, able to mobilize hit squads, provide vehicles and safe houses, and coordinate operations that tied back to disputes over drugs, tenders, or debts. Molef's defense has challenged these characterizations, arguing that the state is overreaching and misreading circumstantial evidence. Regardless of any specific case, the broader picture of a structured hit economy remains a core concern for investigators.
The guns themselves tell their own story. Some weapons that reappeared at multiple crime scenes had, according to records, once been in police possession, either as evidence in earlier cases or as service firearms. How they moved from storerooms to massacre scenes raised uncomfortable questions about internal theft, corruption, and deliberate collusion. Inquiries into these patterns fed into a deeper anxiety that the very institutions tasked with controlling guns and investigating murders may have been, in part, captured or compromised by the same networks. The net effect of this fear economy was silence. Club owners thought twice before speaking about extortion. Taxi operators weighed the risks of defying powerful structures. Public servants who noticed anomalies in tenders had to decide whether pushing further was worth their lives. In this climate, the Big Five's alleged capacity to order or facilitate violence gave it leverage far beyond any single shooting. People did not simply fear death, they feared that if they were targeted, there would be no justice. As cocaine profits and tender money flowed through the system, the ability to deploy violence efficiently became a strategic asset. The firm's old model, using muscle to control taxi routes, had evolved into a cartel-scale system in which hit squads protected multiple revenue streams. Nightlife shootings, township ambushes, and discreet assassinations in quiet suburbs were not anomalies. They were, in the eyes of many investigators, pillars of an economy built on fear. Yet even this apparatus of intimidation could not fully contain the consequences of its own growth. As bodies accumulated and patterns became harder to ignore, the pressure on institutions to act increased. Journalists dug deeper, families of victims refused to be silent, and a handful of honest officers continued to connect dots. At a certain point, the violence itself pushed the story out of the shadows and into the halls of power. That is where the next phase of this narrative unfolds, in the corridors of police headquarters, commission chambers, and political offices, where the question was no longer whether the Big Five existed, but how deeply it had infiltrated the state. Or maybe that's the part nobody in those corridors wants to say out loud. If a cartel can sit this deep inside police structures and party offices, do you honestly believe the system can still clean itself, or has South Africa already normalized a politics that needs these men more than it fears them? Tell us in the comments where you stand on that, and if you want this investigation to keep following the money, the guns, and the names behind closed doors, hit like, subscribe, and make sure this story travels farther than their silence.
Late September 2025, Pretoria. Inside a high-security hearing room, under the glare of cameras and the close attention of journalists, a senior crime intelligence officer sits before the Madlanga Commission. On the record, under oath, he describes something that had long been whispered about in investigative circles, a criminal syndicate he calls the Big Five cartel, operating out of Gauteng. The commissioners lean in as Kamalo details how this cartel isn't just a group of drug dealers or hitmen. According to his testimony, it is a structured network of businessmen, taxi bosses, tender entrepreneurs, and compromised officials whose activities cut across drugs, extortion, contracts, and assassinations. It is protected, he says, by a web of enablers in SAPS, politics, and state-owned enterprises who ensure that sensitive dockets disappear, that certain suspects are treated gently, and that whistleblowers are left exposed. This is not the first time such claims have surfaced. Earlier, General Nunlum Pwanazi, the head of the KwaZulu-Natal Police, delivered a briefing so blunt that it was described as nuclear. In that presentation, he laid out how political killings in his province were tied to organized crime, and how efforts to clamp down on hit squads had met resistance from within the system. The Political Killings Task Force, he suggested, had not been welcomed by all. In fact, some of its work had reportedly been obstructed by people in positions of authority. The picture drawn by these testimonies is chilling. According to evidence placed before the commission, certain alleged cartel bosses, like Vusimuzi Cat Matlala, are said to have enjoyed unusually close relationships with senior police officials. Monthly cash deliveries were alleged in some affidavits, believed to have contained thousands of rand, supposedly handed over at quiet meetings in restaurants or homes. In return, investigators claimed, sensitive information about ongoing probes was leaked and operational decisions were influenced in ways that benefited the cartel. The $360 million SAPS health tender awarded to a company linked to Matlala became a focal point of suspicion. Critics asked how such a significant contract could be granted to an entity connected to a man whose name had repeatedly surfaced in crime intelligence discussions. There were questions about pricing, deliverables, and compliance, but also about what the award itself symbolized: the apparent comfort of certain decision-makers with channeling public money into networks tainted by organized crime allegations. In parallel, figures like Brown Mogotsi appeared in this web as alleged intermediaries, businessmen who could move between political offices, corporate boardrooms, and underworld gatherings with ease. They were described as fixers, people who could set up meetings, relay messages, and arrange introductions that smoothed the way for tenders, licenses, and permits. When allegations about their roles surfaced, they often protested their innocence, insisting they were legitimate entrepreneurs unfairly tarred by association. At the heart of the state-captured dimension of the Big Five saga lies a recurring theme: the manipulation of law enforcement. Witnesses told the commission that certain investigations into cartel-linked figures were delayed or derailed by internal interference. Appointments and transfers of key officers appeared, in hindsight, to benefit the very people under scrutiny. In some cases, officers known for their independence found themselves sidelined or facing disciplinary actions on what looked like flimsy grounds. Crime intelligence reports suggested that the cartel's leadership saw SAPS not only as an asset, but as a tool to be controlled. Access to information about upcoming raids, ongoing surveillance, or pending arrests allowed well-connected suspects to stay ahead of the game. In the worst cases, evidence suggested that some police members did more than just leak information. They actively participated in crime, from escorting suspicious shipments to providing weapons that later turned up at crime scenes. The political dimension was equally complex. Donations, favors, and informal patronage allegedly linked Big Five associated businessmen to certain political figures at provincial and national levels. In some instances, these relationships were described as mutual dependence, politicians receiving campaign support or lifestyle benefits, and in return offering access, protection, or influence over appointments. When allegations became public, most implicated politicians denied any wrongdoing, emphasizing that they had not been charged and describing their interactions as normal business or community engagement. For the ordinary citizen, the cumulative effect of these revelations is devastating. When the line between criminal syndicates and the state blurs, trust in institutions crumbles. A whistleblower considering whether to expose a corrupt tender has to ask, will my complaint be fairly handled, or will it end up on the desk of someone who tips off the very people I'm exposing? A detective building a case against a cartel figure has to wonder if their own colleagues are secretly working for the other side. Yet the very existence of the Madlanga Commission and the testimony of figures like Kumalo and Mgwanazi also highlight another reality: resistance from within. There are still officers, prosecutors, and public servants willing to document, expose, and confront this type of captured network, despite the risks. Their work has begun to map the Big Five cartel not only as a set of names, but as a system, one that hijacks tenders, deploys hit squads, and burrows into the organs of the state. By the time these stories reached nightly news bulletins and court filings, the Big Five was no longer just an underworld rumor. It was a phrase used in official forums, in affidavits, and in questions in Parliament.
The quiet, methodical capture of certain parts of the state by a cartel built on taxis, drugs, and contracts was being dragged into the open. That exposure, however, was only the beginning. As pressure intensified, raids mounted, and arrest warrants were signed, the question shifted, not just how the cartel operated in its prime, but what would happen to its power, its money, and its people when the spotlight could no longer be ignored.
The house in Sandhurst did not look like a crime scene on that morning in December 2024. It looked like success. High walls, manicured lawns, luxury vehicles in the driveway. Neighbors knew that a wealthy businessman lived there, someone whose name occasionally surfaced in business pages and social gossip, but who did not seek public celebrity. When the task team vehicles arrived and officers moved in with warrants, the quiet of the neighborhood cracked. Inside, according to investigators, they found more than just the trappings of wealth. Firearms, electronic devices, and documents linked to tenders and business dealings were seized. Among the papers, police say, were materials relating to Transnet contracts, the very sort of documents that tied engineers like Armand Swart to allegations of irregular procurement. The arrest of Katiso KT Molefe that day was not just another entry in a list of suspected underworld figures detained by the state. It was a signal that one of the alleged executors of the Big Five's enforcement arm was now in the dock. Meanwhile, Vusimuzi Kat Matlala's world was also shifting. Once perceived as untouchable, a man who could attend high-profile events, do business with state institutions, and maintain ties to key police figures, he found himself in a very different kind of spotlight. Charges relating to attempted murders, corruption, and money laundering began to accumulate. The $360 million SAPS tender that had raised eyebrows earlier was now part of a narrative in which prosecutors alleged a pattern of corrupt enrichment and reciprocal protection. Bail hearings became theaters where competing versions of reality were staged. Prosecutors described Matlala and Molefe as dangerous figures with access to vast resources, international contacts, and the capacity to interfere with witnesses and investigations. They pointed to travel histories, foreign trips, unexplained flows of money, and the violence associated with their alleged networks. Defense teams countered that their clients were legitimate businessmen, not crime bosses, men whose success made them targets of envy and politics. Outside the courtroom, the public wrestled with what these cases meant. For some, they were overdue signs that the state was finally confronting an underworld that had long acted with impunity. For others, they raised fears of selective justice, that only certain figures were being pursued, while others, perhaps equally implicated, remained protected. The arrests nonetheless had a real impact inside the cartel and its associated networks. When key executives face charges and the patriarchal founder is gone, questions arise about who fills the vacuum. Simultaneously, the Madlanga Commission continued to hear evidence that fleshed out the contours of the Big Five's influence. The testimony of officers like Kumalo and the earlier warnings issued by Mukwanadzi were now being cross-referenced with documents, phone records, and financial trails. Some who had long been whispered about as untouchable found their names in official transcripts. For the first time, a broad audience could see the outlines of how an underworld structure had embedded itself in tenders, policing, and politics. Exposure, however, brought its own risks. For whistleblowers who had spoken out years earlier and been ignored or marginalized, the new attention was a mixed blessing. On the one hand, it vindicated their warnings. On the other, it reminded them how long they had been left unprotected. For honest officers, the commission offered a rare platform to document how their work had been obstructed, how colleagues suspected of collusion had been shielded, and how morale had suffered in units where loyalty to the law seemed less rewarded than loyalty to powerful criminals.
The question looming over all of this was whether the state's response would be systemic or symbolic.
Would the arrest of high-profile individuals like Madlala and Molefe be accompanied by deep reforms in SAPS, procurement systems, and political funding? Or would it remain largely performative, a handful of trials without fundamental change? Internal power struggles within law enforcement, political factions jostling for advantage, and institutional inertia all complicated the picture. As the saga entered this phase, analysts began speaking of a potential post-Big Five moment, not in the sense that the cartel's influence had vanished, but in the sense that the specific configuration of power associated with Musibi's prototype and his chosen executives was under stress. Some suggested that other figures, previously in the second rank, were already positioning themselves to take over revenue streams and territories. Others argued that the very public nature of the exposure made it harder for any one group to maintain the same level of centralized control. The public, for its part, was left to weigh hope against skepticism. On the hopeful side stood visible actions, commissions, arrests, frozen assets, canceled tenders, firearms traced to crime scenes. On the skeptical side stood decades of history in which powerful criminals and their enablers had slipped through the cracks, reinvented themselves, or returned under new guises. The collapse of one cartel's leadership did not necessarily mean the collapse of the conditions that had allowed it to flourish. Taken together, these threads trace how Jotham, King Muswazi Musibi's taxi empire hardened into the firm, how figures like Vusimuzi, Kat Madlala, and Katiso KT Molefe rose into its executive core, and how taxi power, tender opportunities, and carefully cultivated relationships inside policing and politics fused into one operating system of influence and fear. What has not yet been examined in this story is the engine that investigators say turned that system from a regional power base into a cartel with national reach. The cocaine consignments moving quietly through ports, warehouses, and border posts. Crime intelligence reports describe bulk shipments routed via harbors such as Durban, hidden in commercial cargo and filtered through front companies before being broken down for the domestic market. Prosecutors allege that the same web of businesses and fixers already visible around hospital tenders and police contracts was also used to launder drug proceeds, move cash offshore, and buy protection when loads went missing or landed in police storerooms. Alongside that financial engine sits what detectives call the fear economy, the Gauteng hit squads and contract killers whose work is written in bullet scars on nightclub walls, taxi ranks, and the driveways of businessmen and engineers. Commission testimony suggests that some of the same weapons and intermediaries appear again and again in cases involving assassinated DJs, taxi bosses, and tender whistleblowers. If cocaine money can purchase silence inside police stations and party offices, and if the same rifles surface at both nightlife ambushes and corporate disputes, how far does this protection really extend? And can any state institution honestly claim to be untouched when a cartel's power is rooted simultaneously in ports, bullets, and ballots? Will the exposure of the Big Five cartel mark the downfall of an empire or merely the end of one part in an evolving criminal playbook? As viewers and citizens, we are left with a stark question. How do you dismantle a cartel that has woven itself into the fabric of both crime and government? And if you manage to pull it out by the roots, who and what might grow in its place? The battle between cartel power and the rule of law is far from over, but for the first time in years, there is hope that the cycle of impunity can be broken. South Africa now knows the face of the beast it is fighting. The real test will be whether exposing the Big Five's crimes can finally put an end to the fear economy it created, or whether the system, scarred and reformed, might allow another Big Five to rise in its wake. The answers will shape the country's security, justice, and democracy for years to come. The truth is out. What comes next is up to all who refuse to let fear win. Maybe that's the part nobody wants to say out loud.
When one generation of cartel bosses is exposed, it's often the politicians, cops, and businessmen standing quietly behind them who decide which new kings are allowed to rise. Do you believe South Africa is actually ready to break that cycle? Or will the same powerful people simply anoint another set of Big Five faces while the public moves on? Tell us what you think in the comments. And if you want these investigations to keep naming names, following the money, and tracking who tries to take over next, hit like, subscribe, and stay tuned so you don't miss the next chapter of this story.